That's radical.
So yesterday there was a minor clash between protesters and police at Austurvelli, which is a park right outside the Icelandic Parliament building. So the protesters were asylum seekers seeking to get, a status as a refugee in Iceland, and the police were, well, police, obviously. Now, before I talk about this class, I first want to talk a little bit about, well, refugees in Iceland, and like most Western European countries right now, refugees from mainly the Middle East and Africa, and probably also other places, are flocking over, trying to seek asylum. Now, getting to Iceland, of course, is a little bit more difficult than getting to, say, Italy from Africa. Nothing against the Mediterranean, but it's pretty soft in terms of weather and storms and cold comparative to the ocean around Iceland. So refugees are relatively unlikely to try to travel via boat this way. So we can assume that most of the refugees that try to come to Iceland probably arrive by plane, unless there are some undiscovered tunnels that I'm not aware of. But anyway, there are of course also a lot of legal immigrants in Iceland, depending on what definition you use. Anywhere between 8 to 12% of Iceland's current population is of an immigrant origin. Now it depends a little bit on whether or not you count second generation immigrants, that is, children of immigrants who were born and raised here. Now I have a problem with that definition because one of my parents was an immigrant, so according to this definition I may fall into that category. But then again, I'm white, grew up in Iceland all my life, speak Iceland probably more fluently than most Icelanders. We are failing in the education here in this department. Þið verðið að leggja meiri áherslu á íslenskukennslu. So, yeah, just want to get that out there. But today the topic at hand is not legal immigrants, that's a topic for another day. Today we're just talking about refugees. So, what happened at Austurvelli yesterday is that a bunch of asylum seekers that of course want to be accepted, or not asylum seekers, but refugees hoping to become asylum seekers, gotta get my terminology straight here, that are, well, their status is pending, meaning that they are not yet been accepted, or maybe some of them have been accepted, but want relatives and friends or whatever to be able to join them, or are just trying to show solace with other refugees. I don't know the individual motives of all the said protesters, but yeah, basically they have been protesting. This was I think the fourth protest in this year where they are protesting protesting against deportations, and basically that too few people are getting let into the country as legal refugees or asylum seekers. For this year, the government has decided that they would allow in, I think, 70 or 75 asylum seekers. People that they would actually, provide decent housing for and try to integrate and educate and turn into citizens, I suppose. Suppose that's the end goal. Well, you may be thinking, 75, that's nothing. Obviously the people will be protesting. Yeah, but of course, remember, there are only 350,000 people that live in Iceland, so 75 is like, I don't know, comparative to the United States, that would be like if they were to accept 75,000 refugees, which they may or may not be doing. Although with this guy in office, I'm guessing that they're not doing that right now. So what happened at Austurvelli yesterday was that a few dozen refugees gathered to protest, and some of them started putting up tents in the park, which is illegal unless you have special permit. Now, the police came and tried to take the tents away from them and take the tents down, and apparently there were some minor pushes and a lot of screaming on both sides. Yeah, that's the thing about Icelandic police. When there's a protest, the idea is to always de-escalate, so they don't usually like start hitting on people or pepper spraying people unless something escalates. They'll try to use, you know, words of persuasion and harsh language and kind of push people out of their way to get their things done. But yeah, the police were trying to remove the tents, which the protesters did not have any legal permits to have. And then later the police returned again, this time in greater numbers, as they believed that the protesters were planning to start a fire in the park, also very illegal. Now, an interview with one of the Icelanders who was protesting with the refugees claimed that they had only brought this material of cardboard and some planks to create more signs to write protest slogans on, you know, protesting signs. But the police apparently took took it as that they were planning to start a fire, try to take the material away from them, and then some of the protesters apparently attacked the police, resulting in one of them getting pepper sprayed and two of them getting arrested. And yeah, one of those who was arrested was released yesterday, and I don't know, maybe the other one has already been released. I haven't read all the... maybe I need to read through the news stories again. But yeah, that's the drift of what happened yesterday. It's a minor incident, no major riots, you know, nothing particularly headline-inducing, or nothing that really screams headlines or anything like that. But yeah, a lot of people are painting this as, you know, a violent police crackdown against peaceful protesters. It's just absolute nonsense as far as I can tell. The police didn't interact in any way unless they felt that the protests were getting out of hand, the way it is usually handled. And yeah, you're not allowed to set up tents in the park, you're not allowed to start any fires. So this caused the police to go over to the protesters, and that's where the classes started. Normally when there's a protest, you know, in Iceland, protests are relatively common nowadays. They're usually quite small and you know, don't cause a lot of problem. People usually just stand around with signs and yell things at the Parliament building or whatever institution or whatever they're protesting against. Police usually stand in front of said building and don't intervene unless anything happens. That's at least usually how it is supposed to go. And the key word for the police is usually always de-escalation rather than escalation, for a very obvious reason, because in almost every protest there are always some bad apples who are actually actively trying to get the police to crack down on them, because it'll make the cause of the protesters seem that much more real. I mean, obviously, let's say if the police had attacked the group with batons and tasers and guns or whatever, and 30 people had been injured, yeah, now the entire nation would be outraged and completely on the side of the protesters, which they may or may not be exactly what they want, or at least possibly what some of them were trying to evoke. But okay, incident and Austurvelli over. Now let's just talk about refugees in Iceland. So, as I mentioned before, the protesters were protesting over that they wanted better accommodation for the refugees for when they arrived. Nowadays, most refugees are put into some place called Austurvelli. I don't know how nice or bad the accommodations there are, but apparently it is something that the refugees think that they are not being provided with, I don't know, good enough facilities, so they're protesting against that. Then, of course, they're protesting against deportation. So last year, around 2,900 and something refugees came to Iceland, and all but, I think, 130 of them were eventually deported. And there are some people, I mean, not just the refugees themselves, I mean, obviously they would be outraged, but quite a few Icelanders, yes, the more liberal part of Iceland, that are very outraged about this, you know, and, you know, we want Iceland to accept more refugees and not deport so many people, or some people are even against deportation as a whole. Did I just mention that they deported almost 3,000 refugees? Let me also remind you that we have a housing crisis in Iceland right now. Where are you gonna put 3,000 refugees. And this is just the figure from 1 year. So obviously we cannot just accept 3,000 refugees just like that and thinking there won't be any negative consequence. I mean, let's just say for a moment that all the things you usually hear about. Let's just say that we lived in a world there was no such thing as ethnic tensions, no such thing as racism, no such thing as different religions or whatever things that divide us. Keep all that aside. There still would not be room for suddenly accepting 3,000 migrants out of whim. As I said, we already have a housing crisis. Housing prices in Iceland, or not really Iceland, but definitely the capital city area and many other places are through the roof right now. So, yeah, obviously we're going to end up deporting a lot of these people because we got to put ourselves first. This is a perfect example of people kind of wanting everything at once. People wanting to have the cake and eat it at the same time. Because pretty sure that most of the people who want to accept more refugees would also like the housing crisis to end one way or another. Now, maybe some of them have ideas of there being a more socialized, I don't know, housing system, basically the government providing and building housing. But then again, most of these people don't have the balls to go full socialist and for example, in a political terms, would vote something completely different. A lot of the people who want more refugees, for example, would vote the libertarians, Viðreisn. Yeah, because these people would definitely build socialized housing so that to end the housing crisis. It's like people working against their interests. That's something that I really can't stand. Also, one more thing. Now, this is just a guess on my part, but I'm really starting to get the feeling here in Iceland that an ever-growing proportion of the Icelandic public is kind of getting fed up with A, the amount of immigrants, and B, the amount of refugees. Not because most people have anything against immigrants or migrants individually, but it's just this kind of... people are just getting tired. People are getting tired of going to restaurants and the waiter not being able to, and the waiter not understanding any Icelandic, or God knows what other business, and you know, the servants or people who work there don't speaking Icelandic. And also people are just getting tired of this, of these debates about, you know, you don't want to accept any refugees, you must be a fascist. Now people are just like, no, I just don't think this is our problem. Like, yeah, that's the thing. I think a majority of the people of Iceland just don't care that much about migrants of any sort. I mean, they don't mind it if they enter the country legally and become respectable everyday citizens and work and pay taxes and all that. But when it comes to refugees, people that we have to one way or another accommodate for and educate, by the way, that is expensive. Like these 75 or whatever refugees that they accepted for this year, like the cost around all the background checks, all the vetting and the accommodation and language translators and all of that runs in the billions of kroner. And obviously people also are not in the mood for paying more taxes. So I know that there are some people on the far right who think that, oh, if you don't act now, we're all gonna turn into Sweden or Germany. By the way, very bad example. These countries have very different situations going on for very different reasons, except for the obvious reason that they're all members of the EU. So yeah, what I wanted to say is that unlike what the far right in Iceland is saying, I don't think that most people in Iceland would want that many more migrants or refugees or whatever. They just don't care enough about this issue comparative to, you know, just things that affect them more directly, like their wages, how high their taxes are, housing prices, transportation and such. But I'm pretty sure that if just one or two mainstream political parties, for example, were to suddenly say, yeah, we want to tone down on the amount of migrants we can take, or make it harder for people to migrate to Iceland or whatever, I think a lot of people would just be like, meh, that's good. Klúsiklatan, I'll remember that next time I vote. So, but yeah, we'll just have to see how this all develops, but take it from me, just one guy living in Iceland who happens to have a camera and is standing in front of a wall with posters, that I think in the not so distant future we are gonna probably accept less refugees and probably gonna be less gleeful about immigrants. I think the taste has already been fulfilled and people are, like I said, just getting kind of tired. Just want to move. Icelanders just want to move on with their lives and not being bothered. And I also think that it would be pretty easy for Iceland to all of a sudden have a much more harsher immigration policy than a lot of other countries. I mean, take Germany for example. I mean, they of course have had their history with far-right extremism, so obviously it's gonna be a lot harder for them to suddenly close down their borders, not to mention their status within the EU, yada yada yada. But for a country like Iceland, basically Iceland is so small in the international states that it's the same reason why Iceland can get away with hunting whales. Yes, we still do that, by the way. Whale meat is very tasty. You can also buy whale beer that contains, and I kid you not, extracts from fermented whale testicles. Yes, that's a thing, you should check it out. And so I think in the same manner it would be relatively easy for Iceland to run its own migration policy. Like, nobody would care in the big picture of the world when, 350,000 Icelanders wouldn't want to accept any more migrants. I think that most of the world would simply be like, whatever. Anyway, I am Johan Phoenix. Thank you for watching Das Radical Iceland. Suckers! Iceland is not in the EU. Why did I have to throw that in? Okay. Okay, I lost my train of thought there.
Das Radical!